Hi, and welcome to Theology Thursdays, where we look at the upcoming Sunday's readings and see how they fit in with each other and what they might mean in our lives throughout the week. I'm Nathan Stell, and I'm joined by Laura Stell. This is going to be the fifth Sunday in Ordinary Time. I'll give a little summary of the readings and give my own kind of thoughts on it, and then me and Laura will discuss them a little bit and see what you all think. So this Sunday's readings seem to be, for me at least, about our relationship with the world, our relationship with the things and people in our lives, and how we act within that relationship. And that might make a little more sense after I go over the readings. We start with Job, chapter 7. And Job, most of us know that Job is kind of like the story of this one guy getting everything taken away from him. And in this particular chapter, he's responding to these three friends who are like talking to him, like saying, things like, you must have done something to deserve this. You must have sinned in some way. You know, what's the deal here? And Job's kind of maintaining his innocence, but at the same time, he's lost a lot. So he's going through this really desperate situation, saying things like, "Is not man's life on earth a drudgery? He's a slave who longs for the shade. I shall never see happiness again." He says all these things. That's what the chapter's about. In the second reading, 1 Corinthians, Paul's talking about, that was a really hard one for me, and we'll talk about that more as we get into this, but he's kind of talking about the things in his life and how he acts within those realities in his life. Certain things he allows himself to do if they bring glory to God, certain things he doesn't allow himself to do. But in general, he's saying, he's kind of maintaining his, I'm free to do anything really, and it's only a matter of whether it brings glory to God or not, or brings other people to God or not. And then the gospel is a continuation from last week. Last week we saw Jesus in the temple healing the man who was possessed, and then in this week it starts with him exiting the temple, going straight to, and this is the Sabbath. We weren't allowed to work or travel, so he went straight to Peter's house, and his mother-in-law is sick, so he heals the mother-in-law. Then in the evening, they bring him a bunch of people who are possessed and sick, and he heals them. And then the very next morning, he rises, goes to pray, and then he continues to go all throughout Galilee, continuing his mission and healing people there. So before I get into like my kind of thoughts and how I found a little through line within all the readings this week, the questions I have 3 questions for this week, questions that I'm asking myself and that you can ask yourself, and that we might touch on in this video, but either way, they're good to ask, I think. The first question is, what do we take care of first? Do we take care of our interior before going out and expanding, or do we try to take on so many things outside of ourselves when the part inside ourselves, the spiritual part, the emotional part, the mental part might be a little hungry? So what do we take care of first? The second question is, how are we living? Are we living as Job in the first reading, depressed, sad, not seeing the point of anything in our lives, which I think a lot of us have gone through at various times in our lives? Or are we living out of joy, out of hope, out of an expectation of the glory of God, whether in this life or the next? So what is the joy in our lives, really? Why do we get up in the morning? And the third question is, what do we do when it seems that everything around us is falling apart? Again, like Job, when he's lost everything, what do we do? How do we react to things like that? So those are questions we might touch upon if we have time later on in this video. But again, things to kind of meditate on, things that came up to me as I was reading these readings. So the reason I thought that the through line was really about our relationships with the things and people in our life was because initially of Job. And he loses all these things. He lost a lot. He lost not only his possessions, but he lost his family, he lost his children, he lost his wife, and obviously that would hit anybody really, really hard. And he's having a hard time of it in this chapter. And then also in the second reading, it seems that possibly that Paul has been attacked for doing certain things, kind of like Jesus was. Jesus was attacked for drinking with certain friends, or eating with certain people. There was tons of laws in the Jewish custom, in the Jewish tradition, and so it was so easy to break one of those laws or many of those laws and be attacked for doing whatever you're doing or whatever you're not doing. And so Paul's kind of saying, basically he says, one of the things he says in the latter half of the reading, although I am free in regard to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so as to win over as many people as possible. To the weak I become weak, to win over the weak. I have become all things to all, to save at least some. All this I do for the sake of the gospel, so that I too may have a share in it. So, so he's looking at his own moments of harvest and a famine. It seems to me, talking about moments of famine in Job. Paul's looking at his own moments of harvest and a famine, or of plenty and a famine, and and considering it in a wider scope of how does this fit in with my mission on earth? How does this fit in with my purpose? How does this fit in with what I can do for God, what I can do for others? Sometimes I can have everything that's around me in life, and sometimes I need to abstain. And before this passage that we read in this Sunday's readings, he also talks about how he doesn't want to, if eating meat is something that's going to scandalize someone next to him, his brother, he says, then he's going to abstain from eating meat, so as not to scandalize his brother, or so as not to turn his brother to sin if his brother is not supposed to be eating meat. So again, everything in his life he's putting into the context of how does it fit in with his greater purpose of living out the gospel, of preaching the gospel, and of bringing people to God. And then in the gospel for this week, in Mark chapter 1, with Jesus, we see him handling his own. For me, it's like a matter of time. He's bombarded with all these people who are sick. I don't imagine he had much time to do anything outside of that. And I can find myself wondering how tired he might have gotten, how much he might have felt overwhelmed by all these people coming to him once word started spreading that he could do all these things, that he could heal people. And there was an interesting part that I saw after reading. I was reading another reflection online, and it was mentioning how in the very early morning, it says, rising very early before dawn, Jesus left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. And the reflection I was reading was on how Jesus needed to recharge. That was how he recharged. He went off and prayed. And so I found myself wondering, like, do I do that? Do I recharge by praying? Do I recharge by meditating, by centering myself? Do I recharge by? I think most of the time I recharge by watching Netflix more than anything else. And so my own kind of question to myself: what's a better way to do that? And maybe going off and praying is part of that. But it's interesting that even Jesus, with the little bit of time he must have had, if any, he doesn't use it to do other things he might have been doing, wanting to do. He uses it to go off and pray, and that's the thing that charges him up before he's swept off again in his ministry and goes off to heal people all throughout Galilee. So that's kind of my thoughts on the readings. And I'll just say the questions I posed again one more time. 3 of them, if I can find them. I cannot find them. Oh yeah, there you go. Do we take care of the interior or the exterior first? What do we take care of first? 2, how are we living, in joy or in sorrow? And then 3, what do we do when things around us seem to fall apart? So those are kind of my thoughts, and we can talk more about that. But how do those things strike you?
Well, I think what Job was experiencing really bothers me, present tense, every time I read Job. And I find myself becoming judgmental, and then I have to hold my tongue. I have to hold my mind, stop it, because a person's reaction is simply a person's reaction. And what he went through, I mean, he didn't just lose a few things, he lost basically everything.
Right.
And that's trauma, right? So you respond to trauma with despair. He had nothing left. He had no one left. So that's perfectly understandable. And yet, in Job, he held on to his faith. Didn't have anything else to hold on to. He held on to his faith. And when I can stop thinking of the other long enough to look inside of me again, then I have to reflect, that I have been through those crises in my own life where I felt that I had nothing but God to hold on to. And the things I did have, because I, unlike Job, did not lose everything, um, none of that filled me anyway. None of that was of any good to help the despair that I was in. And so it's only in reaching for God that there comes some peace and some consolation for the loss that you have gone through. And Job also experienced that, at the end of the book. But I think that's an extremely important reflection, especially for those of us who can so easily turn around to our neighbor and say, "Oh, we're just trusting God and all will be fine." Well, yeah, that may be true in the long run, but that dark tunnel that someone is going through is real, and no one should be judged for their for their own reactions to that.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's the part that makes you like bite your tongue and get really upset or find yourself judgmental about Job? You were saying when you read Job, you find yourself getting upset.
Well, it's just
What's the
like
part specifically?
friends, right, that come over and immediately say, you have to look through your life, Job. What did you do to cause this? It's that
Oh, yeah,
natural
sure.
reaction that we have. Those of us that are exposed to the culture that says everything is supposed to go fine in my life. You hear about the gospel of abundance. If you're with God, you pray for anything, and you pray for a house, He's going to give you a house. You pray for, riches, really, seriously. And so when something goes wrong, how do you? It's really hard to not say or think, well, then you must have done something wrong, because if you were with God, this would not have happened to you. And of course, the first thing that all of us think of is, if God is a loving God, then why does this happen? How can God permit this? Or what did I do that God is punishing me? Or so that's a projection onto Job or whoever else. When we go through that, we're constantly looking. Why do bad things happen to good people?
Right.
But the first question is, what did I do to cause this? Not why do bad things happen to good people, because then it's always, then I must not be good, or he must not be good, or she must not be good.
Right. Yeah. And that's the whole point of Job, right? Is answering that question: why do bad things happen to people
Right.
in general? Why does God allow evil, permit evil to exist? And I think the general answer, because Job never finds an answer to that in the book. He never says this is why, but his kind of he kind of resigns himself throughout the book to the idea that none of this was mine ever anyway. And that famous line, God gave and God takes away. God gives and He takes away. And if I was okay with Him giving me so much, because he was a pretty wealthy guy, he was doing really well. He was well off. He was an affluent man, and he essentially his attitude throughout the whole book is, if I was okay with God giving me this stuff, which was never mine, then I have to be okay ultimately with God taking it away, because it was never mine. Even though he does go through those very understandable moments of just complete despair, very human despair, very very emotional places where he's just like, I don't know how to process this. I don't know how to deal with all the trauma, like you're saying. But I think that's what kind of connected it to Paul for me, because Paul's kind of there too. It seems he says, sometimes I can eat meat, sometimes I can't. Sometimes I'm going to be in jail, sometimes I'm going to be free. Sometimes I'm going to be over here, sometimes I'm going to be persecuted, sometimes I'm going to be applauded, for whatever I'm doing. And none of it is mine anyway. It all belongs to God. It all belongs to my purpose here on earth. So those two seem to ring true, like they had that seemed to be the through line for me.
Although I think Paul is actually, when I read that part in Paul, what I'm getting is that Paul is saying that he decides to do these different things because he's trying to fulfill his mission. So in order to evangelize, he will do what his neighbor needs for him to do. And it's not something that's happening to him. I think it's a decision he's making on a daily basis to fit in with the culture that he's in order to not offend, and at the same time be able to open some minds and hearts to the good news, to the gospel. So I think there's a much more proactive thing going on.
Right. And it is proactive. It is proactive because it's Job was more reactive, and Job was like 500 years before
Yeah.
this was going on in the second reading. But it is proactive, and I think that's one of the things personally. If I'm looking at that question that I posed, if I can find it again, there you go. How do I live? The second question: how do we live? Do we live as Job? Do we live as Paul? Do we live as Jesus? I think if this is not a self-help kind of episode. This isn't kind of like how do I avoid sorrow or anything like that by any means. But I think if we can live proactively, and Paul specifically says, if I can find it, he says something about like I've made myself a slave to all. And you're right, it's a choice that he makes, but he preemptively makes himself a slave to the ups and downs of it in his life. So I can imagine him easily saying, and he probably does, I don't know. But he easily saying, "I'm in jail. I chose to be in jail because then I can preach to the guards. I chose to be free now because and it's like I'm okay with the ups and downs. Although I'm sure there were some times when Paul was not feeling very good.
Yeah.
But Paul writes in a very specific way where he's just like this really uses all these hyperboles on either side of extremes and says I'm on one hand I'm a free in regard to all." And yet I've made myself a slave to all, and it is different. So I think that's the key, the fact that he's kind of proactive in his response to the things that might happen in his life, and Job was more of a reaction, but while definitely being understandable. What about what if you go to one of the other questions? How do you I don't know. Kind of like I guess that same question number 2. What do you do? Maybe like an alternate version of question number 2. How are we living? Are we living as Job or as Paul or whatever? How do you maintain a joyful outlook in general? Amidst the ups and downs of life.
I think a lot of that has to do with personalities as far as different individuals are concerned. I don't think my personality, my tendencies are not to be bubbly and joyful all the time. So for me,
Sure.
I don't know if I'm a pessimist or just, I don't know. I tend to just wake up and say, okay, what do I have to do today? That's my wake up, which is not good. When I can refocus that and actually control the thought processes as I'm waking up, just to start with prayer, then my whole day is different. My whole outlook is different. Then I can find joy. Otherwise, if I'm just focused on what are my duties, what do I have to do I have any deadlines, then it's do, and it's all business, it's all I have to, rather than I want to do this, or rather than I do this for the Lord. And even though some of the things I do are ministries, if my mindset is not on God, on my Lord, then I'm not doing Him in a state of love. Kind of reminds me of Mother Teresa telling one of the sisters that was getting up and not smiling that she couldn't leave their house to go tend to anybody until she went back and took a nap and felt better.
Sure.
And I think, and Pope Francis is saying that in The Joy of the Gospel constantly. You cannot serve anyone unless you have that inner joy. And truthfully, inner joy comes only from God. Otherwise, you're tossing and turning depending on what's happening to you. And my happiness then is, am I with someone that I'm having fun with, therefore I'm happy, versus am I not, and therefore I'm not happy. And it's all very superficial then. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
So I go through the whole spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I
definitely. You haven't what?
I haven't been able to, in my own life, I haven't not been able to find a way to be constant in my anythings, and so I go back and forth, and it's like a check and balance thing often, where I have to say, stop. What is it I'm doing, and why do I feel this way? and have to remember I've got to go back and I've got to start, to where my source really is, then things change in me.
Sure, definitely. No, yeah, that reminds me of David Allen. David Allen's a kind of like a self-help guru, and he talks about um, productivity, and he says that being a really productive, organized person isn't about always being productive or organized.
Right.
It's really about what you do when you find out that you're not organized and that you're not productive. Like, how fast can you switch out of it? And that's
Right.
kind of the key. You're always bombarded by all sorts of things. How fast can you switch out of it? Casey and I were talking the other day. She was, that I do like music ministry and I play at church and on Sundays and stuff. And she was mentioning how sometimes, and maybe in the last couple of weeks, I've seemed really irritable on Sundays before, like while getting things ready before Mass starts, and it's true, I totally have been, and I was telling her, I think it's not because I don't want to play there anymore. I think it's because I feel rushed. I'm giving myself the time to pray before I go, and to take some time and just kind of sit and be still and meditate and focus on God and why I'm doing this. So I'm not giving myself that time, and so I'm feeling really rushed. And then that's like the worst feeling for me, is just feeling rushed to do anything.
Right.
That's not good at all. I know this woman who she's a healer, and she was telling me that she wakes up every morning, like her whole, like for 30 years she was a physical therapist, and now she does many different types of healing and therapy. And so, like anybody who's in the health services industry knows that can be very taxing, right? Whether you're any kind of doctor or nurse or therapist of any kind, and it can be really draining on you. And she was saying that every morning she gets about 4 hours of sleep. And I said, how do you function on 4 hours of sleep a night? And she said that she goes to bed, and then about 3 o'clock in the morning she'll wake up, and she'll meditate for about an hour or an hour and a half, and she'll kind of do her own therapy on her. She'll kind of like recharge, like it says Jesus does in the gospel. She'll recharge about 3 o'clock in the morning for about an hour and a half. Then she'll go back to bed for about an hour or so, and then wake up. And that hour and a half spent praying and meditating makes the last hour of her sleep this like super sleep. That she feels completely relaxed after waking up. She feels completely recharged and ready to go. And she only gets about 4 hours of sleep. Now that's probably particular to her as well, but I think it talks about the importance of recharging and giving ourselves that space before anything happens, so that everything that happens can be informed by the groundedness that we got early in the morning. We should probably wrap it up a little bit so we can have a little more time afterwards in case you need to go. Do you have any more thoughts before I give a little final thought?
Well, I think you were basically addressing that number one again, and I think that's settling on, what are my priorities and how do I start my day, and that focus on others at the cost of myself, or refueling myself in order to be able to serve others correctly, the right way. I think that is absolutely crucial, and I think that's exactly what Jesus was showing us by his life, and something that we all did. I think our ministries would be different, our results would be different, our own feelings and hopefully health would be different as well. I think that's the core of what we read and what's coming up on Sunday.
Definitely. So yeah, definitely take care of yourself so that you can take care of others. Heal yourself so that you can heal the world, right? And so I guess just as a final thought, I've often heard that the cure, or a cure for depression, a treatment for depression, definitely, and it is service, is serving other people, is going out, getting out of ourselves and serving other people exactly like Jesus was doing and like Paul is doing. And the key to transformation, to inner transformation, self-transformation, is in helping other people transform. I've heard that a lot. I've experienced that a lot. That seems to be very, very true. Again, going back to the idea of relationship and community that we were talking about last week, Jesus goes out and he starts first, even in his ministry, he starts in the temple. That's his first cure of a person that's possessed, in the temple, in the place of God, and then he goes out to Simon's house. He goes out to the larger community, the village, and he goes out even to the larger community of Galilee itself. All the while, so he's definitely starting within himself, and then every morning he starts within himself, and then goes out so he can be renewed to serve others. And so I guess the final thought really is, in our own service, well, first of all, are we serving? And then if we are serving, is it a service that's grounded in faith, grounded in something stable, grounded in joy, and in the desire to do what we're best at? And is it a service that's balanced in our own time with ourselves, whenever that can be during the day, and something that balances the things we're doing, so that we're not going on one extreme and just killing ourselves, draining ourselves serving, and also not being held back on the other extreme of just staying within ourselves and possibly getting depressed and being subject to all the interior negative things that we can say to ourselves on any given day. So are we balanced? That's really the essential question. And I think I'll just leave it at that. So I hope you guys are balanced, and I hope I continue to be balanced, or start being balanced, because I watch a lot on Netflix. And have a great week, and we'll see you next time.